Hey Inspiro fam. Today we're diving into the incredible story of Helen Keller, a true American hero who turned her darkest challenges into a beacon of hope. Imagine being just 19 months old and losing both your sight and hearing. That's where Helen's journey begins. And trust me, it's going to inspire you to never give up, no matter the odds. If you're ready to be moved, hit that like button, subscribe, and let's get started. Helen Keller was born on June 27, 1880, in a small town called Tuscumbia, Alabama. Back then, the USA was still rebuilding after the Civil War, and life in the South was tough but full of grit. Helen's parents, Arthur and Kate Keller, were over the moon when their healthy baby girl came into the world. She was a bright, curious kid, saying her first words like tea and water before she even turned one. But just 19 months later, everything changed. In February 1882, Helen came down with a high fever, what doctors back then called brain fever, likely scarlet fever or meningitis. For days, her parents feared she wouldn't make it. Miraculously, the fever broke, but it left Helen in a world of darkness and silence. She couldn't see, she couldn't hear. The little girl who once babbled happily was now trapped in her own mind, unable to communicate with the world around her. By the time Helen was 5, her frustration was off the charts. She'd throw tantrums, scream, and lash out because she couldn't express herself. Her family loved her, but they didn't know how to help. Her mum, Kate, would hold her close, but Helen couldn't even hear her soothing words. Imagine being a kid in 1880s Alabama, where there were no iPads, no special ed programs, nothing to bridge that gap. Most folks back then thought kids like Helen were hopeless and couldn't learn, but Helen's parents weren't about to give up on their little girl. One day, Kate read about a school in Boston called the Perkins Institution for the Blind. They'd heard of a teacher there who'd worked miracles with deaf and blind kids. That teacher was Anne Sullivan, and she was about to change Helen's life forever. But we'll get to that in the next chapter, stay tuned. By 1887, Helen Keller was 6 years old, and life in Tuscumbia, Alabama was a daily struggle. Her tantrums were getting worse. She'd kick, scream, and even knock over furniture because she couldn't make anyone understand her. Her parents, Arthur and Kate, were desperate. They'd heard about the Perkins Institution for the Blind in Boston and reached out for help. That's when they got the news. A young teacher named Anne Sullivan was on her way. Anne arrived at the Keller family home on March 3, 1887, and let me tell you, she was a force of nature. At just 20 years old, Anne had already overcome her own tough battles. She'd been nearly blind herself as a kid, growing up in poverty in Massachusetts, and had spent years at Perkins learning how to teach kids with disabilities. Anne wasn't just any teacher, she was determined to break through to Helen, no matter how hard it got. The first few weeks were rough. Helen wasn't used to discipline, and Anne wasn't about to let her run wild. They clashed big-time think-epic battles over something as simple as sitting at the dinner table. Anne started by teaching Helen to fingerspell, a method where you use hand signs to spell out words. She'd spelled DOL into Helen's hand while giving her a doll to hold, trying to make the connection click. But Helen didn't get it. She'd just mimicked the signs without understanding what they meant. Anne didn't give up, though. She knew Helen was smart. She just needed the right spark. Then on April 5, 1887, came the moment that changed everything. Anne took Helen outside to the family's water pump. She held Helen's hand under the cold, rushing water and spelled "wait-er" into her other hand over and over. Suddenly it clicked. Helen's face lit up. She finally understood that the signs meant the wet, cool stuff flowing over her hand. She dropped to her knees, overwhelmed, and started pointing at everything around her, the pump, the ground, and herself, begging for more words. That day, Helen learned 30 new words, from mother to tree. It was like a light switch flipped on in her mind. For the first time, Helen realized she could communicate with the world she'd been locked out of for so long. Anne Sullivan became known as the miracle worker for a reason. She didn't just teach Helen words, she gave her a way to express her thoughts. her feelings, her dreams. This was just the beginning of Helen's journey, and in the next chapter, we'll see how she takes this new superpower and starts breaking even more barriers. Stay tuned. After that magical day at the water pump in 1887, Helen Keller's world started to open up like never before. With Anne Sullivan by her side, the 6-year-old from Tuscumbia, Alabama, was hungry to learn more. Anne had unlocked the door to communication, and Helen was ready to run through it. Over the next few months, she soaked up new words like a sponge, hundreds of them. She'd touch objects like a book or a chair, and Anne would spell their names into her hand. Helen's mind was on fire with curiosity, and there was no stopping her now. By 1888, Helen was ready for the next big challenge. Reading. Anne introduced her to Braille, a system of raised dots that blind people can read with their fingers. At first, it was tough. Helen had to feel each dot carefully to understand the letters, but she was a quick learner. Soon, she was reading simple books, her fingers flying across the pages. Anne also taught her to write using a special board with grooves to guide her pencil. Helen would spend hours practicing, determined to put her thoughts on paper. Can you imagine the thrill of writing your first sentence when you can't see or hear? For Helen, it was like scoring a touchdown in the Super Bowl, but Helen didn't stop there. She wanted to speak, to use her voice like everyone else. In 1890, when she was 10, she heard about a deaf girl in Norway who'd learned to talk. Helen begged Anne to help her do the same. Now this was a tall order. Helen couldn't hear sounds, so she couldn't mimic them the way most kids do, but Anne found a way. She teamed up with a speech teacher named Sarah Fuller in Boston, who taught Helen by letting her feel the vibrations of her voice. Helen would place her hand on Sarah's throat and lips, feeling the movements as Sarah spoke words like "it" and "hot." Then Helen would try to copy those movements with her own mouth. It was exhausting hours of practice every day, but after months of hard work, Helen said her first clear sentence, "I am not dumb now." Her voice was shaky, but to her family, it was the sweetest sound in the world. Helen's progress blew everyone away. In a time when most people thought deaf and blind kids couldn't learn much, she was proving them wrong, left and right. By age 12, she was writing letters to her family and reading books in Braille, like the Scarlet Letter. She even started going to school, first at the Perkins Institution in Boston, where she met other blind kids, and later at a school for the deaf in New York. Everywhere she went, Helen showed the world that disability didn't mean inability. She was breaking barriers not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been counted out. This was just the beginning of Helen's rise. In the next chapter, we'll see how she takes her story to the world stage, becoming a voice for millions. Stay tuned, Inspiro fam. What do you think it took for Helen to learn to speak without ever hearing a sound? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story's firing you up, give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to Inspiro, and hit that notification bell. We've got more of Helen's unstoppable journey coming your way. By the time Helen Keller was a teenager, she was already breaking barriers most people couldn't even dream of. With Anne Sullivan by her side, she'd gone from a frustrated little girl in Tuscumbia, Alabama, to a student who could read Braille, write letters, and even speak. But Helen wasn't content just helping herself. She wanted to change the game for others too. In the late 1890s, she set her sights on something even bigger: college. In 1900, at age 20, Helen enrolled at Radcliffe College, the sister school to Harvard. She became the first deaf and blind person to earn a college degree, graduating with honors in 1904. Talk about a trailblazer. While at Radcliffe, Helen wrote her first book, The Story of My Life, with Anne's help. Published in 1903, it told her journey from a silent world to one filled with words and ideas. The book was a hit. People across the USA and beyond were blown away by her story. It wasn't just a memoir, it was a wake-up call, showing the world what people with disabilities could achieve if given a chance. Helen's words struck a chord, especially in a time when many disabled kids were hidden away or written off. After college, Helen hit the ground running as an advocate. she teamed up with organizations like the American Foundation for the Blind, AFB, to fight for better education and job opportunities for the disabled. She traveled across the USA, giving speeches that left audiences in awe. Picture this: Helen on stage, her voice still a bit hard to understand, but her passion crystal clear as Anne interpreted for her. She spoke about equality, urging people to see the potential in everyone, no matter their challenges. Her message was simple but powerful. Disability doesn't mean inability. Helen's impact went global in the 1930s and 1940s. She visited over 30 countries, from Japan to France, meeting with world leaders like President Franklin D. Roosevelt and even the Emperor of Japan. Everywhere she went, she pushed for better schools, libraries, and resources for the blind and deaf. During World War II, she visited wounded soldiers, many of whom had lost their sight or hearing, and inspired them to keep going. One soldier later said, "If Helen Keller can do all that, I can handle this." That's the kind of ripple effect she had. By the 1950s, Helen was a household name in the USA, a symbol of hope and resilience. She wrote more books, like The World I Live In, and even appeared on TV shows, sharing her story with new generations. Through it all, she never stopped fighting for what she believed in, that everyone deserves a shot at their dreams. Helen Keller didn't just live her life, she changed the world. In our final chapter, we'll look at her lasting legacy and what we can learn from her today. Stay tuned. By the 1920s, Helen Keller was a force to be reckoned with. She'd graduated from Radcliffe College, written The Story of My Life, and traveled across the USA, speaking out for the blind and deaf with Anne Sullivan by her side. But as Helen entered her 40s, life threw her some new curveballs. Anne, her lifelong teacher and companion, was starting to struggle with her own health. Anne's eyesight, already weak from childhood, was getting worse, and she often felt exhausted. For Helen, this was terrifying. Anne had been her bridge to the world for over 30 years. The thought of losing her was unimaginable. To make things even tougher, Helen and Anne faced financial struggles. Public speaking brought in some money, but it wasn't always enough to cover their expenses. In 1924, Helen joined the American Foundation for the Blind, AFB, as a spokesperson, which gave her a steady platform to advocate for the disabled. She threw herself into this work, traveling to places like Chicago and New York, meeting with lawmakers and pushing for better education and jobs for the blind. Her speeches were electric. She'd stand on stage, her voice still a bit hard to understand, while Anne or a new assistant, Polly Thompson, interpreted for her. Audiences couldn't get enough of her passion and grit. Around this time, Helen also started forming new friendships that would shape her future. One of her biggest fans was Mark Twain, the famous author of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Twain had met Helen when she was just 14 and was blown away by her intelligence. He called her one of the most remarkable women in history and often invited her to his home in Connecticut. Through Twain, Helen met other influential figures, like Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, who'd been working with the deaf for years. These friendships gave Helen a boost of confidence. She realized she wasn't just a student anymore. She was a leader who could inspire others on a massive scale. Helen's work with the AFB also opened her eyes to new possibilities. She started dreaming of going back to her roots education. She'd always believed that learning was the key to freedom, and her own college experience at Radcliffe had been a game changer. Now, she wanted to dive deeper into that part of her story, to show the world how education could transform lives, especially for those who'd been counted out. Little did she know, her time at Radcliffe was about to become an even bigger symbol of hope for millions, a story we'll explore in the next chapter. Helen's journey was entering a new chapter, one where she'd face personal losses, build new alliances, and revisit the moments that shaped her. Her college years at Radcliffe were a turning point, and in Chapter 6 we'll take a closer look at how she made history there. By the late 1920s, Helen Keller was a household name in the USA, but her mission to help the blind and deaf was about to go worldwide. At 47 years old, Helen was brimming with energy and purpose. Her work with the American Foundation for the Blind, AFB, had given her a platform, and now she wanted to take her message to every corner of the globe. With Anne Sullivan and their assistant Polly Thompson by her side, Helen embarked on a series of international trips that would cement her as a global icon. In 1931, Helen traveled to Europe for the first time, visiting countries like France and the United Kingdom. Everywhere she went, she met with educators, government officials, and leaders of schools for the blind. In London, she spoke at a conference for the blind, urging better access to Braille books and vocational training. Her words hit hard. People couldn't believe a woman who couldn't see or hear was speaking with such clarity and passion. Anne would spell the audience's questions into Helen's hand, and Helen would respond through Polly, who interpreted her words. The crowds were blown away, often giving her standing ovations that she couldn't hear but could feel through the vibrations of their applause. Helen's biggest international impact came in 1937 when she traveled to Japan. At the time, Japan had few resources for the blind and deaf, and many disabled kids were hidden away, seen as burdens. Helen visited schools, met with the emperor, and gave over 50 speeches across the country. She shared her story, showing that with education and support, anyone could thrive. Her visit sparked a movement soon after. Japan opened its first permanent school for the blind, and Helen's influence led to more inclusive policies. One Japanese teacher wrote, "Miss Keller showed us that our students have limitless potential." Helen's trip wasn't just a visit, it was a revolution. Back in the USA, Helen's global travels made headlines. Americans were proud to see one of their own making such a difference abroad. In 1938, she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the White House, who praised her as a symbol of what's possible. Helen used the meeting to push for more federal support for the disabled, and her voice helped shape policies that would later improve access to education and jobs. Through it all, she never forgot her roots in Tuscumbia, Alabama. She often said that her small-town upbringing taught her the value of community, a lesson she carried with her everywhere. Helen's international work showed the world that disability didn't define a person's worth. She wasn't just speaking for the blind and deaf, she was speaking for anyone who'd ever been counted out. Her courage, her words, and her unshakable belief in human potential left a mark on every country she visited, proving that one person's voice could echo across the globe. What do you think about Helen taking her message to the world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story's firing you up, give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to Inspiro, and hit that bell for more stories of hope and resilience. What's been your favorite part of Helen's journey so far? Let us know. As the 1940s dawned, the world was gripped by World War II. Cities were being bombed, families torn apart, and millions of soldiers were fighting for freedom. For Helen Keller, now in her 60s, this was a time of deep reflection. She'd spent decades advocating for the blind and deaf, but the war brought a new kind of challenge. Many soldiers were coming home injured. Some had lost their sight, others their hearing, and they faced a future filled with uncertainty. Helen knew she had to step up. In 1943, Helen began visiting military hospitals across the USA, a mission that would become one of the most meaningful of her life. With her assistant, Polly Thompson, since Anne Sullivan had passed away in 1936, Helen traveled to places like Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. She met with soldiers who'd been wounded in battle, many of whom were struggling to adjust to their new reality. Some had lost their sight from explosions, others their hearing from the constant roar of gunfire. Helen understood their pain in a way few others could. At these hospitals, Helen didn't just offer words, she offered hope. She'd sit by a soldier's bedside, placing her hand on theirs so they could feel her presence. Through Polly, she'd share her own story, how she'd turned her own disabilities into a life of purpose. One soldier, a young man named James who'd lost his sight in the Pacific, later wrote, "Miss Keller made me believe I could still live a full life. If she could do it, so could I." Helen taught these soldiers practical skills too, like how to read Braille, or communicate through touch. Her visits weren't just a morale boost, they gave these men tools to rebuild their lives. Helen's work during the war wasn't limited to soldiers. She also spoke out for civilians, especially children who'd been orphaned or disabled by the conflict. In 1944, she partnered with the American Foundation for the Blind to raise funds for war refugees, many of whom needed access to education and medical care. She wrote articles for newspapers, calling on Americans to support these efforts. "The war may take away sight or sound," she wrote, "but it cannot take away our humanity." Her words struck a chord, inspiring donations and support from across the country. Even in her 60s, Helen's energy was unstoppable. She traveled thousands of miles during the war years, often under tough conditions. Wartime travel meant crowded trains, food shortages, and the constant fear of air raids. Yet she never complained. For Helen, this work was personal. She knew what it felt like to be counted out, and she was determined to show the world that disability didn't mean the end of a meaningful life. Through her actions, Helen became a beacon of light in one of history's darkest chapters, proving that hope and compassion could shine through even the toughest times. The end of World War II in 1945 brought peace to the world. But for Helen Keller, now in her mid-60s, it was a time of quiet struggle. She had spent the war years traveling across the USA, uplifting wounded soldiers and raising funds for refugees. But beneath her tireless work, Helen was grappling with a profound loss that had shaken her to her core. Anne Sullivan, her teacher, mentor, and closest companion, had passed away in 1936, nearly a decade earlier. While Helen had kept going through the war, the absence of Anne hit her harder in the quieter years that followed. Anne had been more than a teacher to Helen, she was her bridge to the world. For almost 50 years, Anne had spelled every book, every conversation, every experience into Helen's hand. She'd been there through Helen's breakthroughs, her college years at Radcliffe, and her rise as a global advocate. Losing Anne felt like losing a part of herself. In the late 1940s, Helen often found herself reflecting on their time together. She'd sit in her home in Connecticut, running her fingers over the braille letters of Anne's old notes, feeling the weight of her absence. "I felt as if the light had gone out of my life," Helen later wrote in her book Teacher, a tribute to Anne. But Helen wasn't one to stay down for long. She had Polly Thompson, her assistant since the 1930s, who'd become a trusted friend. Polly couldn't replace Anne, but she helped Helen navigate her grief. Together, they sorted through Anne's belongings, reading her letters and rediscovering the lessons Anne had taught her, not just about communication, but about resilience and love. One letter from Anne read, "You have the power to change the world, Helen. Never forget that." Those words reignited a fire in Helen. She realized that the best way to honor Anne was to keep pushing forward with the mission they'd started together. In 1946, Helen threw herself back into her work with the American Foundation for the Blind. She began writing more, pouring her emotions into articles and books that shared her story and Anne's role in it. She also started traveling again, this time to countries rebuilding after the war, like Germany and Italy. In these places, she met children who'd been blinded or deafened by the conflict, and she shared the same message she'd given soldiers. Your challenges don't define you. Helen's presence brought comfort to families who'd lost so much, and her own grief gave her a deeper empathy for their pain. Through this period, Helen learned to find joy in small things. She loved feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, the scent of flowers in her garden, and the vibrations of music through a piano. These simple pleasures reminded her of Anne's lessons about finding beauty in the world, even when you couldn't see or hear it. By facing her grief head-on, Helen discovered a new kind of strength that came from within. She'd lost her greatest guide, but she'd gained a deeper understanding of her own resilience, a gift that would carry her through the years ahead. What do you think about Helen's journey through grief? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story is inspiring you, give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to Inspiro, and hit that bell for more stories of hope and resilience. What's been your favorite part of Helen's journey so far? Let us know. By the 1950s, Helen Keller was in her 70s, but her passion for change was as strong as ever. She'd spent decades advocating for the blind and deaf, but as the world around her shifted, so did her focus. The 1950s in the USA were a time of tension and transformation. Women were pushing for equal rights, and the civil rights movement was gaining momentum as African Americans fought against segregation. Helen saw these struggles and knew she had a role to play. Her own life as a disabled woman gave her a unique perspective on what it meant to be overlooked, and she wasn't about to stay silent. Helen had always believed in equality for women. Back in 1911, she joined the women's suffrage movement, supporting the fight for women's right to vote, which was won in 1920. Now, in the 1950s, she spoke out for women's economic rights. She wrote articles and gave speeches calling for equal pay and better job opportunities for women, often pointing out how disabled women faced even greater barriers. "Women, like the blind, are too often denied their potential," she wrote in a 1952 essay. Her words carried weight. Helen wasn't just a symbol of resilience. She was a woman who defied every expectation, and her voice inspired others to demand more. At the same time, Helen became a vocal supporter of racial equality. The 1950s saw the early sparks of the civil rights movement, with events like the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision that declared school segregation unconstitutional. Helen was deeply moved by the fight against racism. She had experienced prejudice herself as a disabled person and understood how unfair systems could hold people back. In 1956, she wrote a letter to the NAACP, praising their work and calling for an end to racial discrimination. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," she wrote, echoing the spirit of the movement. Helen also used her platform to connect the dots between different forms of oppression. She spoke at events where she linked the struggles of the disabled, women, and African Americans, urging people to see the bigger picture. At a 1957 gathering in New York, she shared how her own challenges taught her empathy for others. Through her assistant, Polly Thompson, she told the crowd, "We must stand together, for only in unity can we build a world where everyone is free to thrive." Her message was clear. True progress meant lifting everyone up, not just a select few. Even in her 70s, Helen's determination was unshakable. She faced criticism. Some said she should stick to disability rights and not meddle in other issues. But Helen didn't back down. She knew that all forms of injustice were connected, and her life's work was about breaking down barriers, no matter who they affected. Through her words and actions, Helen showed that courage isn't just about overcoming personal challenges, it's about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. By the 1960s, Helen Keller was in her 80s, and her life had become a living testament to the power of resilience. She had faced challenges that most couldn't imagine, losing her sight and hearing as a toddler, navigating a world that wasn't built for her, and losing her beloved teacher, Anne Sullivan. Yet she'd turned those challenges into a mission that changed the world. She'd fought for the blind and deaf, women, African Americans, and war veterans, leaving an indelible mark on history. In 1964, the USA decided it was time to honor her extraordinary contributions. On September 14, 1964, Helen received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. The ceremony took place at the White House, where President Lyndon B. Johnson presented the award to her. Helen, then 84, sat quietly as her assistant Polly Thompson described the moment to her through touch. The medal recognized her courage, determination, and service to humanity, citing her education, advocacy, and social justice. Johnson called her a symbol of the unconquerable human spirit, and the room erupted in applause, a vibration Helen could feel deep in her bones. For Helen, this wasn't just a personal honor. It was a recognition of the millions of disabled people whose lives she'd helped improve. Even in her 80s, Helen's mind was sharp, and she spent much of her time reflecting on her journey. She lived in a quiet home in Westport, Connecticut, surrounded by her books and memories. With Polly's help, she continued to write letters to friends, schools, and organizations, sharing her thoughts on the progress she'd witnessed. She was thrilled to see how far the world had come, for the disabled Braille was more widely available. Schools for the blind and deaf had multiplied, and laws were starting to protect the rights of the disabled. But Helen also knew there was still work to do. She often wrote about the need for more inclusion, saying, "The walls of prejudice are crumbling, but we must keep pushing until they fall completely." Helen also found joy in looking back on her life's milestones. She remembered the day she understood the word water at the pump, her college graduation from Radcliffe, and her travels to Japan. Each memory was a reminder of how far she'd come and how much Anne Sullivan had shaped her path. In her later years, Helen often spoke of Anne with a smile, feeling her presence in every achievement. She also cherished the friendships that had sustained her, like those with Mark Twain and Alexander Graham Bell, whose encouragement had fueled her mission. The Presidential Medal of Freedom was a crowning moment for Helen, but what truly mattered to her was the impact she'd had on others. Letters poured in from around the world, parents thanking her for showing their disabled children what was possible, activists inspired by her fight for justice, and teachers using her story in classrooms. Helen's life had become a beacon of hope, proving that one person, no matter their challenges, could change the world through courage, compassion, and an unwavering belief in human potential. What do you think about Helen receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story's inspiring you, give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to Inspiro, and hit that bell for more stories of hope and resilience. What's been your favorite moment from Helen's journey so far? Let us know.